Thank you for the invitation to participate in this conference. The title of my presentation is Exploring Spelling Evolution and Educational Approaches to Dyslexia. Spelling often poses a challenge for individuals with dyslexia, and this issue can continue throughout their lives. This occurs because dyslexia affects phonological processing and memory, making it difficult to perceive the sounds in words and decompose them into smaller segments for spelling. Individuals with dyslexia often mix up letters that sound alike. They often interchange the sequence of letters, and they incorrectly spell frequently seen words. Finally, they find it challenging to recall and replicate the structure of words that fail to adhere to standard spelling rules. Dyslexia is a neurological condition present in all languages, but its manifestation may differ from language to language. Also, it has been demonstrated that an individual may display dyslexia in one language while not having it in another. In other words, while dyslexia is a neurological learning disability that influences reading and language processing, its effects may potentially differ based on the language involved. One of the factors contributing to this phenomenon is orthographic transparency. Certain languages exhibit a more stable connection between letters and sounds or phonemes than others. This means that letter-sound correspondences are more consistent, often resulting in less severe reading challenges for dyslexic individuals. Spanish, compared to English, has a more regular spelling. That is, letter-sound correspondences are more consistent. Nevertheless, Spanish speakers with dyslexia still frequently face challenges in spelling. Despite Spanish being regarded as an orthographically transparent language that has a fairly stable letter-sound relationship, there are some areas where Spanish spelling is not consistent. For example, the letter H is written but is not pronounced in any dialects of Spanish. The letters B and V are pronounced alike in all dialects of Spanish. The letters J and G are pronounced the same in certain contexts. QU is pronounced like a C or a K in some cases. The letters Z and C are pronounced in some dialects just like the S, and the double L, or ella, is pronounced in some dialects just like Y. We examine the historical origin of these spelling complexities in Spanish and explore potential activities to assist learners with dyslexia to cope with these issues. So let's start with the phonological systems. You can see the phonological system on the left for Latin, where the letter, the sound H was pronounced, but is not present in Spanish. Also, we have two semiconsonants in Latin that had a different manifestation in Spanish. Finally, Spanish had a number of fricatives that have appeared that were not present in Spanish. So these changes in the phonological system of Latin and Spanish are going to have an impact on the spelling. So let's start with the H issue. As I mentioned earlier, Latin, the sound H in Latin was maintained in Old Spanish, but disappeared in modern Spanish. So habere in Latin gave haber. Latin initial F in modern Spanish words that descend from Latin by popular transmission, the Latin F has two outcomes. Either it disappeared altogether, in which case the modern orthography replaces the original F with the now silent H, as in farinam gave harina, or it survives in the labiodental fricative F, as in fuerte or frío. By the 16th century, H was on the way to being eliminated from the phonemic inventory of Castilian Spanish, although the letter H was retained in the spelling system and remains there as a curious anomaly in an otherwise largely phonemic system. So these are examples of the H issue. The VB issue. Latin V derived into Old Spanish fricative B, and also in some cases in modern Spanish, B, the stop B. In the Iberian Peninsula, the labial semivowel W, corresponding to Latin V, must have developed into a labial fricative or approximant, specifically the bilabial continuant B. In initial position, this B contrasted phonemically with the bilabial stop B, corresponding to Latin B. This contrast appears to have continued into Old Spanish. In word internal context, medieval Spanish does not appear to have had separate reflexes for Latin V and B, but apparently being used in both cases. This is shown in misspellings, cases of misspellings. So, for example, haber, spelled like servir, comes from habere, servire comes from servir. So you can see habere has that B and servire had a V, but they were both spelled the same way. showing some confusion. In medieval Spanish, words that had intervocalic P in Latin are fairly consistently spelled with a B, implying that they were actually pronounced with B rather than B. For example, the reflex of Latin lupum for wolf was spelled lobo with a B. However, towards the end, Old Spanish also weakened this to the fricative lobo as it is pronounced in current Spanish. What internally the approximant B and stop B then ultimately merged, probably no later than the 15th century, just as they did in initial position. The result of the word initial merger was the loss of the stop articulation, except after a nasal, given the Spanish B, rather than the loss of the approximant. In this way, we arrive at a modern allophony of Spanish B. So these are the cases of the VB issue. So you can see that vaca is spelled with a V, but it's pronounced vaca with a B, with a stop B, bilabial. And valle is spelled with a V, and it's also pronounced the same way. Basura, however, is spelled with a B, and it's also pronounced B, with a bilabial stop. And then servir and haber, as I mentioned earlier, or lobo, are pronounced with a fricative B, even though in some cases we spell it with a B, and in some cases we spell it with a V. Let's move on to another issue, the JG issue. Latin E seems likely in initial position and intervocalar positions to have come to be pronounced as the palatal fricative J. In initial position, the palatal pronunciation is retained in modern Spanish, only before stressed or back vowels, and yace. Before unstressed non-back vowels, initial Latin E has no reflex in Spanish, as can be seen, for example, in the verb echar from jactare. So the E disappeared altogether. Before back vowels, initial E has a J sound as a reflex on Spanish, but this sound was subsequently devoiced and then underwent retraction to the velar position ja. So we have from jocum in Latin, we have juego in modern Spanish, and iuctum gave junto, judaeum gave judío. In intervocalar position, the phonemic correlate of E appears to have been geminate, perhaps J, as in, for example, mayo. In syllable final position, before any consonant other than R, the Latin velar consonant were semi-vocalized as ya, the latter sound then becoming a trigger for palatalization of the following consonant. So we have in Latin tectum that gave techo in Spanish, dixi gave dije, and apicum gave abeja, signa gave seña. Of the Old Spanish reflexes shown above, che and ña continue unchanged into modern Spanish, while the other two underwent further modification in early modern Spanish. First of all, the j sound was devoiced and so merged with the sh. Then the place of articulation of sh was retracted to the velar area, producing ja in la canabeja and dije. The palatalization of the sonorants N and L produce another problem. The palatal nasal ñe, the famous ñ in Spanish, and the voice palatal alveolar j in medieval Spanish. The latter sound stemming from an earlier palatal ya. The palatal nasal ña continues unmodified into modern Spanish, while j was first of all devoiced to sh and then gave ja, like aragnium gave araña, but allium gave ajo. First asho and then ajo, and filium gave ijo or isho, and then gave hijo. So these are examples of the spelling consistency for J and G. So you can see the letter J in red is, pronounced ja, and the letter G is also pronounced ja the same way. Let's move on to the double L issue. For Latin initial pla, fla, and cla, when immediately preceded by a voiceless obstruent at the beginning of a word, L appears to have had a palatal articulation, as in ya or sha, and spelled with a double L. So planum gave llano, flamam gave llama, and claving gave llave. However, they are pronounced the same way in many dialects of Spanish. So we have llano is spelled llano in some dialects, but it's llano in some other dialects. Llama, but llama. Llave, but llave. and yeso and yo are pronounced the same in all dialects. So then the double L and the double Y and the Y are inconsistent in the way they're pronounced in dialects. Another issue is the Q issue. In some cases, the K sound occurred in sequences Q in Latin, and it was spelled QU. This was generally reduced to K before the Old Spanish period, whenever it was followed by A on E, but it continued to be spelled QU. So we have quomodo gave como, and quaero or quaero in Latin gave quiero, and it was spelled with a Q and an E. And quidecim gave quince. All right, so you can see that the sound is K, though we spell it with a U that is not pronounced. So you can see here examples of that inconsistency. So we have a U for quiero and quince that is included coming from Latin, but is not pronounced at all. Moving on to this Z and C issue, we have the K and G sound before back vowels, and R were retaining retain their velar articulation. So we have casa has been maintained as casa, arco más arco, gaudio más gozo, and so on and so forth. However, due to lenation, K and Ga are often realized as the velar approximant Ga in intervocalic position. So we have acutum gave agudo, and so on and so forth. Before front vowels, Latin K is likely to have had a fronted or palatal articulation as J. So circa, pronounced circa, pacem, and so on and so forth. With the word, when the front vowel following Latin K was unstressed and preceded another vowel, it evolved into the palatal semivowel J. So editium gave editio, and brachium gave bratio. Okay, the palatal allophone J, with or without J, derived into Ch in Old Spanish. The J in this string then assimilated, creating the voiceless dental velar affricate Ts. So we have this Ts sound in voice cases that were spelled as a cedilla in Spanish, as you can see there. And or when it was voiced, it was spelled with a Z. So we have cerca in Old Spanish, and we have peces, and we have brazo, but we have vecino. Like its voice counterpart, the K, the voice velar phoneme J, must have had a palatal articulation before front vowels, deriving into J. When not preceded by a consonant, this J, from Latin G, either had the palatal fricative J, as is reflected in modern Spanish, or it is lost altogether. In intervocalic position, the J outcome is found in words in which the vowel immediately following the J was semivowel. So, for example, fagiam gave aya. In the absence of an immediately following J, the intervocalic J was generally lost throughout the nation. So we have magistrum that gave maestro, but then is maestro. And corrigiam was corrigia, but now it gave correa. So the J sound disappeared. In word initial position, the J from Latin J was lost in unstressed syllables, but evolved into J. So germanum gave germano first, and then hermano, disappearing altogether. When preceded this, preceded the sonorants N or R, the postpalatal yeah was realized as Z. So gingivan gave enzia first, and then we're going to see that it goes to enthia, and then argillam gave ardillam. Okay. With the exception of R and S, the Latin coronal consonants were all palatalized when they occurred immediately before J, corresponding to an earlier front vowel in hiatus. In the case of the stops tilde, the outcome in medieval Spanish of the palatalization process is identical with the outcome of the palatalization of K and J. Accordingly, both J and J are realized as S and J, as we saw earlier. So we have cazar, we have marzo, orzuelo, but we have pozzo, razón, and poggio. In the late Middle Ages, the two dental affricates S and Z became deaffricated and voiceless, evolving over the course of the 15th century into the dental fricatives th in Castilian Spanish. However, in general Spanish, the deaffricated and voiceless reflexes of earlier ts and z was the fricative sibilant. sa. So that's a dialectal difference between the two. As a result of this, we have a spelling inconsistency. In Castilian Spanish, we have the th and the sa pronounced as the. Okay, so there is a certain inconsistency, but it's pronounced. So we have two letters with the same sound. But in general Spanish, the problem is even worse because we have three letters. The Z, the C, and the S all pronounced the same. So we have calza spelled with a Z. We have vecino spelled with a C, but we have paso spelled with an S. So Z, C, and S are pronounced the same, three letters with the same sound. So as a result of this, we have the 10, among the 10 most commonly orthographic errors in Spanish is the distinction between V and B. It occurs throughout the place. Incorrect use of the letter H. Interchanging the B and the V in many other cases, as well as the G and the J. So these are some of the examples that I've mentioned earlier that are derived into that. So what methods can we use to help people with dyslexia? So we have, what we have to do is a systematic work with arbitrary spelling. Those are the cases of the problem issues that I've seen. So work on what you want to do is you want to work on one specific spelling rule. For example, the one that deals with B and V for several weeks. And so we have a number of rules that you can see here. Is used at the beginning of a word, after a consonant or after M. For example, bien, brillante, embrujar. The V, however, is used at the beginning of a word, but after a vowel, as in wine, sail, and airplane, and so on and so forth. We have to read and understand and apply the most important and generalized spelling rules for the grapheme B and V. So the users need to become familiarized with these rules, even though the rules are not 100%. We have to also carry an active learning process, explaining by a certain word why a certain word is spelled with a B and V, going back to its historical origin. We also want to apply the spelling rules in alternative ways. For example, we look for words in a text that comply with the spelling rules you're working on. You can also make cards with spelling rules and others with examples of those words that follow the rules and play memory games with them to match and to do multiple activities, as you can see here in the example. You can also make a list of words of examples that follow certain spelling rules and words that violate that spelling rule. And you can use those lists to play a game of guessing using spelling rule each word follows. For this, the word list should not include the rule they correspond to. So the user should be kind of aware of the spelling itself. We can also play games such as defining the words in the list for another person to guess what they are about. We can make tongue twisters, inventing riddles, playing to see who can memorize the most words, etc., etc. You can use the list to work on reading speed. To do this, the student must read them while timing it. These activities usually motivate them, since they're reading by reading them several times, the reading speed should increase as they will feel more competent. So you can go through the list, as you can see here, and you can read the words corresponding to the rule as quickly as possible, repeatedly. You can practice the spelling with these using interactive spelling activities. You can, for example, create a visual spelling notebook in which we write down frequently used words that we normally make mistakes with. It helps to make a drawing with the word in question in which we highlight the confusing letter. Every time we do a dictation, we can transfer to our notebook the common words that the student feels he or she always doubts about the spelling of it. In our notebook or spelling folder, we can make a table to write down the most frequent errors in dictations or compositions, and each time we find them to make a mark. This can help us to know which words are misspelled and most frequently, so we will remember their spelling. When there are very common words that we write incorrectly, in addition to drawing in our notebook and writing it down on the table of common errors, we can spell it with our eyes closed, trying to visualize it mentally, creating it with a plasticine, for example, or another moldable material, associate a gesture or a sound or an image or anything that represents a spelling, as you can see in the images. You can write that word in big letters and trace it with your fingers. Say it out loud and then close your eyes to imagine its shape until you visualize it mentally. Additional exercises that we can do for working with arbitrary spelling for these issues in Spanish, I work with visual spelling cards created by us or from those provided, for example, by Yaldi, play matching games, write essays, or any type of activity with those problematic words. Find all the words in a text with doubtful spelling and underlining them, trying to visualize them mentally, spell them without seeing them written, and then ask someone to dictate them to us, and finally correct the dictation, usually using the original text. Ask those who correct our dictation copies, homework, or essays not to cross out our mistakes, but to put the number of errors next to each line so that we can try to discover them. They usually separate errors by the number of accents and the number of other errors. So these are some of the additional activities that you can do to work with those problematic areas in Spanish. And some of the ideas that we have to kind of compensate for them of the neurological issues of dyslexia. Thank you for your attendance, and bye-bye.